I
Uh,
look like I'm on your podcast, dude. So,
that's
no.
cool. Yeah, I could just introduce it. Welcome to the Loren Penniless podcast with special guest Isaac Hayes.
We are the Outcast Intellectuals, and this is the Outcast Intellectual Podcast. The kindness of the modern day element that we were kind of talking about before have always been interesting to me because I think in a lot of cases people kind of explain away that things can't be this way like in the real world, or that's just the way things are. And I think in a lot of cases it's kind of just people making excuses for something that could be changed because, for example, I've had people who've given me rides who insisted on being paid gas money, and I've had people who've driven hours and hours to see me, never had the assumption about it at all, you know. And even in in marketing, like there are people who, like, whenever they talk about referring somebody, they always kind of like find a way to slip in the mention of like a referral fee. With you and other people that I've talked to who've like helped me out a lot, every time I've ever mentioned it, it's like, no, don't worry about it, you know?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's, I guess, kind of like where I'm coming from. And I imagine that you'll probably credit a decent amount of your kindness to your faith, because I'm sure it does have something to do with your upbringing. But I guess just kind of to go off of it, have you kind of noticed, I guess, a difference between like the beliefs and notions of kindness and treating people, from that place of abundance, as we say in the industry, but whatever
Mhm.
term it would be,
Mhm.
and like where you come from, like it, and if so, like how do you kind of, I guess, mix that, in the day to day.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, uh, it probably does come a lot from my faith, but I've never really explicitly thought about that too terribly much in most spheres. I guess, and I take that back. I have, but really, like being kind to people makes me feel good. Like at the end of the day, is so it is kind of self-serving in some sense. Not that that's the only reason I do it, but one of my actually one thing I really like to do with people that I know from my church and ministries and things like that is just write letters to them to encourage them. Like it's so rare that people get like handwritten letters now. So
uh,
I'll take like, I mean, a good chunk of time. I mean, I'll take an hour and a half, something like that, and write several pages of like kind of a handwritten note just to encourage them, like how I see God working in their life and the ways that I see them being gifted and the ways that I see them serving with effectiveness, and always try to encourage them with some scripture as well, just kind of some encouraging words there. And I found that like after doing that, it has made me like feel great, like feel so much joy, and like it's lightened my mood. So that a lot of times now, honestly, like when I'm kind of down in the dumps and I'm not feeling so hot, like I'm just like, man, if I like write someone else a letter, like I will genuinely feel better. And it happens, because I think it's just like that process, not only of helping someone else out and strengthening their faith and encouraging them, but in the act of writing that letter, I have to stop and I have to think about, it's not just, hey man, hope you're doing well. Cool, bro, fist bump and send them a letter. Like actually think about how God's really working in their life, and what I can really encourage them for, where I see them really, like I mentioned before, their giftedness, and where I see what good I see them doing, what good God is doing through them. And it's just an opportunity, give God praise for what He's doing through them. And so it's just like thinking about that and meditating on that, gives me a lot of joy and just really kind of brightens my day as well. So it's really the same with other people in other spheres. I remember, like I never really liked networking. I never liked, I should say, the idea of networking,
mm,
because I went to some marketing convention like a couple years ago or whatever, and I didn't really talk to anyone. And I knew I probably should like network and introduce myself or whatever, but I just pretty much like was silent and I just listened to the talks and, you know, then went to my hotel room or whatever and didn't go to any of the parties or anything like that. I don't think I had access to a lot of those things anyway, but, it was just it was okay. But, the networking thing just felt predatory in
Schmoozy.
a way. Well, it felt like I had this image, a few events that I had kind of been to. It was always like there's the cool person in the room that everyone gravitates to, the person that's the you know, that has the big business, that is someone you want to know in the industry, the mover and the shaker that you can get something from. And people would
Mm.
basically surround that person almost like a vulture. And it just, I never really liked that feeling, you know. And it was nice to like meet people and talk to people, but I am, believe it or not, like introverted. So
Mm.
it's not like I had to kind of force myself to kind of get out of my shell a little bit. But I was actually at uh a virtual event. It was the Copy Accelerator virtual event after COVID. So I guess that would have been like what,
Okay, I was gonna
September-ish.
say, yeah, because I every event that I've been to for them, you always went in person. So yeah, it must have
Yeah.
been back then.
It was when it was all virtual, and that was my foray, you know, my first experience with the Copy Accelerator world. I'd heard about them, like people were like, "Oh man, this mastermind that's like, you know, 15K," and I was like, "My goodness, like that's ridiculous!" Like, you know, at the
Right.
time, where I was just like, "Who would ever like that's amazing!" Like I would hear about these masterminds are like 25K or something. I'm just like, "That's insane."
Three
Um,
years later.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Little do they know, right? But but I remember going to the digital or the all virtual uh Copy Soda event in September. And it was, of course, you know, when COVID was, that restriction stuff was at its height. So
Mhm.
it was only virtual. And they did these little networking kind of tables afterwards. And I was around that point that I realized I needed a network. It was around that point I realized that a lot of my, and I'm going on and on. If you want me just to be quiet and keep to the topic, just let me know. But
Yeah, man.
one of the things I realized about my career was I'd always worked inside agencies, so I had never had the network. I'd never had to go out and get clients. I never had to go out and get gigs. I just got fed work because I had a job right inside these
Mhm.
agencies, which I enjoyed, and I still work with and love those guys. But I realized that like there were people who I would say were my peers in terms of skill level, who were making way, 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 way more than me. And it was because they were in these networks and they were the ones that people thought of when these lucrative gigs came along instead of, you know, me. So I realized I needed a network. That was kind of the next step for me in my career. And so I went to, you know, these networking tables, this Copy Accelerator virtual conference. And the way
Mhm.
it worked, it was like these air meet, I think was what or air was it air meet?
Yeah, I remember
Yeah.
hearing about that. I never did the
It
virtual
was
thing, but
it was really cool. I actually really liked it.
mm,
Because it was like everyone was virtual, right? So it was all kind of like this forced awkwardness on everyone. So I mean, I can understand now. I love the in person more, but at the time, it was like everyone had to deal with it because, you know, there was no there's no alternative, and people would be at these tables trying to, you know, communicate, but it was like it wasn't like one person. I don't know. It was a good conversation, and the coolest thing about it was the tables were, you weren't as in control about where you needed to go. There was limited space at the tables and you weren't exactly sure who everyone was. So it's not like everyone just gravitated like a vulture to the one guy that
mm,
was going to give them gigs. It was kind of, everyone was kind of dispersed out to these tables. So you would literally be at a table with like a guy who heard about copywriting in the last couple months and doesn't have any client. And this is just, you know, they just want to go to this virtual event to start this new career. They'd be next to like someone who owned a 9-figure business, and everyone was so cool and everyone wanted everyone else to win. And like one of the things I remember I started off the conversations then by asking people like, what's your biggest win? You know, and like what brag about yourself about what you've accomplished in the last couple of months. And it was just cool, like seeing everyone spread out on that spectrum of, you know, skill level, income level, whatever you want to say, like their status in the industry. But
mhm.
everyone was so nice and like and was so excited about everyone else's wins, and everyone else wanted everyone else to win. And I think part of that was because that was just kind of that Copy Accelerator, that culture at that time was just really conducive to that, where They didn't tolerate any jerks. And so that was a big testament to the culture that they had. But it was also just, I think, the awkwardness of air meet that everyone was going through. But
Unsettled people enough where they couldn't just kind of like feel
yeah,
comfortable enough where they're trying to go about things the normal way.
exactly. But it made me realize like that was actually in fun. Like that was actually fun. That was enjoyable. So
Mm.
like my idea of networking like really kind of shifted to where, and it's like, I know people are listening to this like mind blowing, like duh, like this is what everyone's already known. But to me, it was like this big revelation, it was kind of like, oh, this is actually enjoyable. Like I like networking. I like talking to people. What were you
Yeah.
gonna say?
Well, first of all, I was going to make a joke about Revelation because,
Oh
it's,
yeah, we were talking earlier about all the Bible puns, right?
yeah, I can't help it, as long as it's in good fun, I can't help it. But just the reason why I didn't, like interrupt aside from not wanting to be rude, but, because when it comes to the nature of like the holistic nature of these things, sometimes you really do need to kind of, I want to say meander, but go around rather than through.
Mm.
And what you were talking about, oh, and by the way, Chris Lynn's in the comments, like just lighting up, saying dream team. And yeah, she
Aw.
was joking. Lauren, oh yeah, Lauren is so selfish for being so kind. It's,
Well, hey,
um,
Chrislyn.
yeah, it's when you said, if I'm getting off track, stop me there. I'm sure she was
Mm.
laughing on the other end because we get off track all the time. But the thing about the kindness element is that it comes back to like what you were talking about, where people were mutually appreciating each other's successes.
Mhm.
Because, like, for example, virtually everybody that I've had on the podcast is in marketing, which is kind of funny because it's almost like the only people who will show up are the
Yeah, it's
ones who are in
a
business,
circle. That's fine.
But it's the reason why I mention this is because, like, okay, say that you're listening to this and you're not in marketing. Say that you work, 9 to 5 in whatever industry it's at. You're watching it, whatever. Um, it still applies because that person who would cover your shift
Mm.
because they saw how stressed out you were and they cared. It's very different from somebody who's thinking, oh well, one of these days I'm going to want my Friday off, and then then I'll be able to pull this, this card out on him or something. Or you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and I do believe that how you do anything is how you do everything. And it's funny that like your kind of business card in a certain way, at least among like other like peers, as far as I'm aware, is your kindness. Like
Oh, that's cool.
it is like an inside joke of it's like
Mm.
like typing like Loren colon. Oh yeah, here's a short loom for you. 40 minutes of just like
Yeah.
completely free, but like, high level, freaking critique.
Mm.
And like, you just like, there are people who make less money than you who are more, like finicky about like giving their time out. Like, if you really think about that, but like, you're so giving in all these different ways. And it isn't just from like, well, I wouldn't even say even just from, but it isn't from that kind of self-motivated element beyond, feeling good and all that. But like,
Mhm.
you could feel good and record a 5-minute video. You know
Yeah.
what I
And
mean? But you don't.
yeah, and I think part of it is like, I don't know, like I've always enjoyed like making looms for people. I geek out and like I actually enjoy the craft of what I do. So it is
Mhm.
fun for me to teach it. And I kind of have, I mean, my particular way of looking at things that I think is instructive for people. So I genuinely feel like, hey, this will actually be helpful. And I enjoy geeking out on kind of what my, I don't want to say passion because that makes it sound more exciting than it is, but something I really enjoy talking about. But I have on multiple occasions I've had times where someone talked to me. I can think of a guy, and he was like, I guess I had tagged him in a job post,
Oh,
or
you never
that
do
someone.
that. Right.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I would always do it because I just thought like I saw people tagging people, and I would just be like, well, I'm going to tag everyone. And it was fun for me.
Right.
Right. And like, I would be like, prior to some of the events, I'd be like, all right, like, tell me, like, I actually legit have a spreadsheet where I have like everyone's, like, what they've told me in terms of their niche that they're interested in, and like the type of
Mhm.
copy that they write and the type of gigs they're looking for. So like every time I would see one of these gigs, I've been kind of lax about it lately for personal reasons, but hopefully I'll get back into, I need to get back into that. But I'll see one of these, gigs on like one of these job boards, and I'll just like literally go through my spreadsheet and tag everyone. Just cause I just kind of, I want everyone to succeed, and it's fun for me. But I one guy was telling me one time, he's like, that I like changed his life because I like had tagged him in a gig, or I don't even remember honestly whether I tagged him in a gig or I had like connected him to someone.
You're
But
so
like,
kind and helpful that you don't
well,
remember when you're helping people in their life
I mean,
changing
kind of,
ways.
that's kind of the way, but that's kind of the point, is like, I've done that a lot. And to me, it was like not a big deal. You know what I mean? And I think that's like, that was an instructive moment for me. It was like, what honestly I hadn't even remembered that I had done, he said was life changing for him, because it was a gig that came at just the right time that kind of was a springboard to get him lots of other gigs,
Yeah.
and I've had that before where like I remember helping people, and I would kind of walk them through some Facebook ads, send them some samples, kind of a loom of like, I think they wrote an ad and I was like, here's what I do differently, and here's what I like, and here's what maybe you
Yeah.
could change. And they ended up, the ad that was crafted after that feedback, of course, they're a very good copywriter anyway, so I'm not taking credit by any means, but after my little feedback, they were able to craft a good ad that the business owner really liked, and that got them a really great retainer. And that was kind of
Mhm.
like, for them, like their upward trajectory, and so people look back at stuff like that and they're really grateful. But to me, it was like, it was really instructive because it wasn't that big of a deal to me, but I could make a real huge impact. And it made me think about times that people have like connected me with gigs that like have changed my life. Just a chance connection, or someone saying a kind word or referring you or whatever, that have been like life changing for me. And it was kind of, well, this has happened to me. I could be that type of person for other people.
Yeah.
So, it's just something that I've enjoyed doing, and I think you can't go wrong like putting that out there and helping people.
Yeah.
I think one thing that's been helpful is, I think a lot of people, I was just actually thinking about this the other day, like kind of the term nice guy.
Mm.
And this is going down a totally different rabbit trail. Like, but the term nice guy a lot of times has a negative connotation when you think
Yeah.
of like,
Nice guy finishes last. Yeah.
yeah, well, you think of like, that type of red
Like people
pill
pleaser.
pickup artist, like
Oh
that
yeah.
type of community. Like the nice guy is the guy who appears to be nice, but like really he's just trying to like,
Like a wuss, basically.
well, he's trying to, he has what's called like a covert contract or whatever, that
Oh, that's
basically,
such.
yeah, he's going to be nice. So like take a young lady or whatever, like he's going to be friends with this young woman, so that leads to a relationship, and then he can like, sleep with her or whatever.
Right.
So there's this kind of negative spin on just like being a nice guy. And I think I was actually just thinking about this a day or two ago. Like one of the things that helps me is that like I've been married for 18 years. Like my wife and I actually a couple of days ago just celebrated our 18th anniversary. Like I'm not trying to get in a relationship, right?
Right.
Like I'm not trying to, like, I think that having a little bit of that age and kind of enough, being a confident enough in myself, I can be genuinely nice. And I think people feel that I'm not out with some ulterior motive of like
Yeah.
trying to, if it were a young lady, like trying to have some type of relationship with her, like, no, like,
Yeah.
don't worry about that. Right. Not going to happen. Or with a guy that I'm like, going to steal his gigs, or that I have some type of negative ulterior motive. I think that you kind of get to a point where like you're strong enough that it's like you can be nice and
Yeah.
just unashamedly nice, because it's not, I don't have anything to defend. Like I'm confident enough in myself. Like I'm not worried that someone's going to take my niceness as weakness, you know?
Right. Yeah. It's funny because I've had a lot of like thoughts that have occurred to me, even just as you've been talking about it. And as, a guy who generally is considered younger, uh, I do experience that kind of impact where like I can tell where like when I'm nice to a girl or something, not that it's all cases, but I'll definitely see that kind of response where it's like that wariness, like I get it because I don't know who I am, right? In a lot of these cases. But at the same time, I get frustrated because I'm just trying to be nice. And it's like, no, I'm not, you know, I I'm not gonna slip you like a piece of paper with my number on it or something like
Mhm.
that. You know what I mean? I'm just like, and this was the case even before I was in a relationship. Like that had nothing to do with it. Uh,
Mhm.
so it is interesting how like there's almost not a stigma against kindness, but a skepticism regarding it.
Mhm.
And I guess before I kind of move on to that, I mean, I've experienced that same thing you've mentioned also with helping others out, where I have some pals that I talk to. Uh, they're in Africa. I don't remember the specific nations for each, but like I know like one buddy, he's from Nigeria. Never been on a call with him. Never, we've done like voice messages. It's the closest we've been to like an in-person kind of, well, face-to-face chat. But I've like looked at his copy. I've given him advice and stuff like that,
That's
and it's
cool.
not
Yeah.
a big deal to me. Like you, it's like it's not it's not a big deal. Like I think if somebody treats that kindness like a big deal, that might be a bit of a red flag where it's like, where if they see like this is a huge deal in that sense, is like, well, why do you consider what you're doing for others to be like this huge thing? But my point being is that some of those guys have been like, this is like a huge deal. Like I know you could be doing all this other stuff and such. Like they're so appreciative of it. And originally I was just saying, yeah, I'm happy to help just because I was happy to help. But then
Mhm.
I do end up feeling really good by knowing that I had that impact on them, even though I wasn't going into it trying to seek that feeling, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So it is interesting how like kindness for kindness own sake. I've always believed that way. Like if like you're always paying for people's dinners at the events, like and you don't expect any accolades for it, which is why I'm going to give you accolades for it,
Mm.
and not just because I'm one of those people whose dinner is being paid for, um, but I'm the same way when I buy somebody something where it's like oh like I think I was with Johanna, who's
Of
in our
course. Yeah.
group.
Mhm.
Uh, and like some other gals who I remember specifically who they were, but like people who are listening to the call won't necessarily know. Uh, and like she had ordered a drink and they both got put on like my tab or whatever. She's like, "Oh, do you have Venmo?" Like, don't worry about it. I'm not gonna like. You don't need to Venmo me for like $5 or $6 or something
Mhm.
like that. Because it accidentally got put on my card.
Yeah.
Um, so it just is interesting to me how that simple kind of kindness does seem to be, I'm not going to say lost in the modern day, but it's definitely lost in kind of the bustle. You
Mm.
know, um, you see those videos of the people giving money to the homeless person and stuff like that all the time. And hey,
Mm.
if you want to make a homeless person's life a little bit better, then by all means. But I also always end up seeing those comments that say, well, would you have done that if you weren't recording it?
Mhm. Yeah.
Are you like a person who makes hundreds of thousands of dollars a month and you're giving somebody $500 and you're going to, write that off on your taxes as like an advertising expense because you used it in an ad or something like that,
Mm.
you know?
Yeah.
So that is interesting to me is kindness as an act versus kindness as a spectacle, you know?
Mm. Yeah. No, I could certainly see that where, you know, there's the Bible story, actually multiple ones about people giving and
Mm,
sounding trumpets to announce to everyone, hey, like look at all this money that I'm giving. And Jesus said, like, no, that's, they've gotten all of the reward that they're going to get.
Mhm.
And I think there are people that enjoy the praise of men, that they, when they perform those acts, it's more about how they look, exactly. And I think that's something, to guard against, because I think that that temptation to want to be praised is within all of us.
Mm.
And I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing as long as it's in its proper place, right?
Right.
Um, but yeah, no, it's certainly, that can be what we're chasing. Instead of doing the right thing for the right reason, it becomes the right thing for the wrong reason, and then
Right.
it's not the right thing anymore.
Right. Wanting to be seen giving rather than just wanting to give.
Yeah, exactly.
And I guess because it's interesting to me to think of kind of where the motivations come from where that's concerned, because as we talked about, on another episode, I'm not uh, religious, and it's interesting to to say that I don't have any faith, as you kind of mentioned, like it's kind of it means a little bit more than I might say, because you said like to believe in whatever, like you always have a faith of some sort, in
Mhm.
whatever it is, even if it's just yourself. So like
Mhm.
I can't really say I don't have faith in anything without kind of tripping myself up based on the other conversation.
Yeah.
But I
Everyone's
don't,
making a choice, even if you don't think you are. Everyone's making a choice.
yeah. And it's interesting to me in the sense of like, because one thing that's kind of associated, I think, often with people in religious communities, I'm not going to say people of faith because of like kind of the follow up here, is that like the notion of those who are only being kind because they believe they need to be to get to heaven. You know what I mean?
Mm. Mhm.
And I don't think it really takes that much examination to be able to tell the difference between somebody who's like that and somebody who isn't. Because I think somebody who's like that will be like that regardless of what the actual belief system is,
Mhm.
compared to like their character as an individual. But like even though you know are a devout Christian, you're strong in your faith and everything, that is that's not why you're kind to people, you know? And
Mm.
so it's interesting to me that even when a belief system is so fundamentally rooted in the nature of sin and like goodness and redemption and salvation and such, even then it's still there is that striation of individuals. It's almost like it doesn't really matter what your beliefs are in that case. It's just a matter of your, as I see it at least, like quality as a person. But at the same time, you don't see yourself as a low quality person,
Mm.
but you never say like, oh yeah, like I did this by the way,
Yeah, well, I think that, it's interesting. There's a lot of, you said a lot there.
Yes, I
I
did. Sorry.
no, it was some deep stuff. Um, I think there is an element where people do things in order to be seen by other people and to be, praised for that. That's one thing. But you mentioned, doing things because you think you should or something. And that's an entirely different thing. A lot of people do these acts of kindness because they think that earns them brownie points with God, or they think that will purchase them, God's favor, right? And so that they'll be blessed in however they want to be blessed, or that's what they have to do to get salvation. And the thing is, that's actually really, really, really tempting.
Hmm.
And that's part of kind of the way we are as humans, is that we work for things. We tend to think that we've got to do something, and that's part of the reason why the gospel message is so countercultural, because the gospel message is to, trust in Christ, in his sacrifice, that, his sacrifice was sufficient to pay the penalty for your sins. It's not now that, okay, you trust in Christ and you also uh, do all these other things on top of that. that together, that's how you're going to be saved. That's actually not the message of the gospel. The message of the gospel is faith and faith alone.
Mm.
But then again, it also says if you have real faith, you'll do these things. But that's not the reason, that's not what saves you. It's just that that real faith, if it's a living faith, it's going to naturally manifest itself in those actions. So
Mm.
yeah, like, so what you're saying is who are you when you are nice, when you do perform these kind deeds, why do you do it? And I would say, like, you know, I've given to charities and stuff like that before, and ideally the reason is because, hey, I am grateful to God that he saved me, you know, and as an act of worship to him, not because I have to, not because this is earning me anything, not because I could repay him, because I could never repay him, but not to lessen the debt that I owe him or anything like that,
Mm.
but just because I'm so overcome with worship for Christ and appreciation for what he's done, and just reveling with joy in that, that's going to turn me into the type of person that's just going to love other people. Right. So that's kind of, I do think that it flows, yeah, from my faith in a way that you love other people. Like, that's kind of, it is tricky in the business world, because it may not explicitly be in Jesus's name as much as, I mean, I would like it, people to know that it is, but you kind of just end up, it is kind of a little socially maybe strange to say that to someone. I'm doing something nice in the name of Jesus, but maybe it gets to that point where that's not awkward. But yeah, I do hope that is what people see, that, you know,
Mm.
it's not just like that guy's a nice guy, but that guy exhibits love in the way that, you know, Jesus loves.
Yeah, well, I think when it comes to that element of honoring anything, really, it is something where, like, it's not that it's so foreign that people can't get it, but it is one of those things where more often than not, you know, it's like not everybody's just going to get it. They're not, because not everybody, like, something that I had to learn the hard way is that people can only see things, perceive it, whatever, from the level that they're at. They may
Mhm.
be able to kind of feel like the essence of it if you come from a different place,
Mhm.
which is like what happens when somebody's like really low and you do something kind for them, and it means a lot. But, like, if somebody doesn't understand what it means to honor something because they don't have like, they're in such a survival kind of attitude, you know, they're thinking very animalistically, they're just not going to be able to kind of associate with that, right? It's the same thing with, like, when you have somebody who, like, say that they go to prison and then they find, you know, whether it's a faith or just like a balance in their life, whatever it is, while they're in there, there's kind of that, like, that juxtaposition of, like, that significant reaction of, like, kindness and faith versus, you know, all the violence that's going on around them. And I
Mm.
think when it comes to the notion of that kindness, whether it's, you know, in a stressful situation or just, well, the normal world can be plenty stressful, but just not as much as prison, I would imagine. Um, it's interesting to me to think of it from the perspective that, like, anybody can be nice theoretically when things are going well. Like,
Mhm.
it's really easy for somebody to give money when they have lots of it to give, right? But when people continue to be kind, even when things are not going great for them, you know, that I think that speaks more to it, because then it shows that they're not just giving away because they have, now they're giving away because, for lack of a better word or phrase, they must, because they're
Mm.
compelled to do it.
Mm.
And at least from my perspective, like, I personally think that, like, at least from, like, the feeling that I get from you is that even if you didn't have the faith element, like, I still think that you would be doing these kind of things, that you would still be a kind person, because it's not like you're going to be thinking about that every time you do something nice. Like, every single time you're kind to somebody, like,
Mm.
do you always have that mental process of, oh, I'm going to honor God right now? Because it
Well,
seems like it's reflexive.
I think I mean, that's an interesting question. And I think that's impossible to answer because really that's kind of like asking me, how would I behave if I were a completely different person?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Because it's
Like
so fundamental
it
to you.
is, oh yeah, absolutely. It is like part and parcel with who I am. Like it is foundational to the way I act and the way I think and the way I look at the world. So how would I act without faith? Like I have no idea. You know what I mean? Because it would be
Right.
it's such a part of the fabric of who I am would be changed. That and I think also, like, what's the point of kindness? Like ultimately, like, because here's what I believe is, like, in a million, like, what is going to matter in a million years? Because I believe in a million years, there I will be in heaven, and I will look back at life, and some things will matter and some things won't. And even though some people will look at like an act of kindness not done, in the name of Jesus, not done thinking about Jesus, they would look at that and say, well, that was nice. Certainly wasn't like a bad thing necessarily, right? Like,
Hmm.
from in the world's eyes, but um eternally, like, it's meaningless. And even a nice thing done, as we've talked about, for the wrong reasons with a sinful heart, apart from Christ, is there's nothing. So that's the way I try to look at everything I do. I
Hmm.
kind of my routine, which is probably not super surprising, but every morning I'll wake up and did this morning as well, kind of read my Bible. I'm kind of have a plan I'm going through,
Hmm.
and think about that for a good chunk of time. And then I have a red light, my Juve kind of red light therapy,
Okay.
and I'll stand in front of it for probably about half an hour, 15 minutes on my front, 15 minutes on my back. And I will that's my time to pray, kind of my
Hmm.
time to, like, meditate and to think. And that's what I pray a lot, is like, I want to live a life that matters. I want to live a life that matters for eternity. And it is sometimes challenging that, I look and I see friends of mine who are pastors, people I know who are missionaries. Their full-time job is going to remote parts of the world to plant churches and preach the gospel to remote peoples. And it's challenging to look at, like, where I am and be like, well, like, am I just kind of like, does my work matter in the same way? I mean, it can, because there's different callings. Not everyone is called to be a pastor. Not everyone's called to be a missionary. You can be called to just be a, Facebook dork like me, right? But the, what you do needs to be done in, independence, and just in that conscious living, that what
Hmm.
you're doing is for Christ. So that if I go out and I try to do the best job of what I can do, if I'm faithful to my calling, and try to be the best, media buyer, copywriter, marketer that I can be, and try to help the world and try to, make Jesus look good, I think that that's going to, in a million years, I'm going to look at that and say, that's exactly what I should have done. And that's what is it, that's what mattered. So anyway, that's a very long way of saying that I think that the world, the way I look at the good or bad in an action, might be different from how the world looks at it. That I think it is totally possible to give sacrificially, and to give, but not in the name of Jesus, and it not really matter
Yeah, I guess
in
it's.
eternity.
I think it's interesting in that sense where, because for you there's definitely that inherent element of not not Jesus equals only goodness, but definitely necessarily includes goodness.
Mm.
And even if somebody, is like me, where it is not faith based, as we've understood it,
Mhm.
um, I still do those things in the interest of goodness as I perceive it. And it's funny because I don't really believe in karma either. So
Yeah.
it's like in that case, it's one thing if, if you don't believe in a God of some sort and like you still believe in goodness. Okay, you could still believe in a karmic cycle and it still makes sense why you would believe in goodness in that sense. But then if you don't believe in a karmic cycle, it's kind of funny because I like look at myself from like outside myself in that sense where it's like, okay, well then what is the point? Because
Yeah.
you
Why
can
do you think you're doing it?
see, that's the interesting thing. I've been opening doors for people since I was in kindergarten.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody taught me to do it. I didn't I didn't have an older sibling who did it. I didn't have like a father who like raised me to do it. Like nobody taught me to. I just did it. Nobody like taught me to like cover somebody with a blanket if they were sleeping and they were cold.
Mm-hmm.
Like even if it was the only blanket that I had. That was just how I had always been. And so when I think of it, I think for me, like partially is just that I like originally was just naturally a very sensitive person for that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, people throw around a lot of different terms now, like empath and stuff like that. I'm not going to make a claim to this, that, or the other thing. I just cared a lot. Like I was the kid who, like, if somebody else, like another kid was like stomping on ants, I'd push the kid into the grass because I couldn't stand him, like what are they doing to you? Right. If
Mm-hmm.
kids were poking like a frog with a stick or something, I always shove them down or, whatever, because like, what's the matter with you was like how I felt, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And it is funny because I can't point to something that made me be like that. I think it was just maybe I never unlearned it in that sense. Like
Mm-hmm.
as you know, from like the calls we've been on together, I'm not really a fan of excuses for myself or from other people. And so for me, I think a lot of the things that happen in life that for other people may kind of pollute or like confuse their notion of kindness and goodness,
Mm-hmm.
I could never accept it. So like if something like negative happened to me, I still felt like what I was doing was the right thing. You know what I mean? And so I never kind of lost that faith, whatever it is, in whatever form that takes, in that what I was doing was the right thing there. So I think it is similar in that sense. Um,
I know why you do it. Because you're a creation made in the image of God. And that's why, right? Because God is good and God innately is love. So when that part of us that is protective, that part of us that is caring towards others comes out, that's because you're made in the image of God and that's how God is. Because you see the downtrodden and you care. You see the cold and you want to give them a blanket, as you mentioned, because you care, right? And then you see injustice, someone poking a frog with a stick or something like that,
mhm.
someone taking candy from a baby, someone bullying someone else, and that makes you angry. Why does
That's
that
the
make you?
candy.
Why is it?
So,
Yeah, why does it make you angry? Right? Because you're made in the image of God, and God is a God of justice. So when you see injustices being done towards other people, our innate, as humans, like our innate reaction is one of anger at that injustice. So whenever you see across all cultures these acts of kindness, these acts of anger towards injustice, this sense of morality that all of us tend to share, that this is right and this is wrong and this person shouldn't poke a frog with a stick, but it is right and commendable to see someone cold and to give them a blanket. That morality all comes from just what is innate to us because we have a conscience and we were made in the image of God. So that's my personal belief.
right. And I mean, I also am not trying to make the call about like debating like the essence of it as well. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like for me, it's like again, like it's kind of like what we arrived at the end of the other episode that we did together. It's like we can both honor the essence of it, even if like how we see it isn't ultimately the same thing, because like if I was thinking from like just like a free flowing narrative, then I would say, okay, well then if that's because I'm made in the image of this, then why do other people not be that way? So
Mm,
that's like that would be the first thing that would occur to me. But regardless of to not turn this into like a refutation of the belief, because it's not my intention,
mhm,
it does come back to that essence of that commonality of people caring. And like one other perspective on it could be, and this isn't one that I share uh wholeheartedly, at least partially, but like for example, we are programmed genetically by whatever means to be altruistic. And so one could say that it is also a kind of psychological, biological inclination to ensure the preservation of your species,
mhm,
because benefiting the whole would be, on average, greater than, benefiting yourself. Same thing as like, this is kind of me being a little bit like odd in this sense, but I think that in a lot of cases, suicide and like people's inclination towards it is almost like a sort of like self-destruct button so that people could not be like harmful to the group. And again, this is just my lone kind of suspicion of it, where but it's like a lot of these things I do think have fundamentally biological components.
mhm,
I don't believe that it's as as simple as that is, because I do believe in something beyond like just biology in that sense. Um, but that is something else that I could imagine would be in there in that sense, because otherwise, why would people feel that need to do the kind thing in quotes? I don't really think of it as a kindness if they're not doing it because they're actually kind, but that nice thing
mhm,
because they want to be seen doing it or because they want a reward for it. I think
mm,
that that is fundamentally, at least as I see it, more of that biological kind of programming element of, oh, this is something I should do because I'll be rewarded for it or because it benefits others.
mhm.
And I don't really, you know, have a spiritual, energetic, whatever reason for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I know there are lots of competing explanations. I mean, clearly, I'm not saying that mine is the only,
But
but,
but it is valid. It's not like you should not be able to share it simply because,
yeah. And I think, and totally departure from that, which kind of came to me as you were talking. I think a lot of the reason that people would give this kindness and then want to be praised for it, I think a lot of that is kind of modern in just um, the economics of it, which seem to be pretty modern, like the idea of company supporting specific causes is, I think, relatively modern. Um, and giving to charity because of and then it's all economic driven, right?
Hmm,
Like that such and such company gives to such and such foundation so that they can then
tax
sell more of
write-off.
their product. Well, tax
Oh
write off
yeah,
too. Yeah,
okay, yeah,
exactly. And then get clout so that they can sell more of their product. That's why they all advertise it and everything else. We do all this so that we can, sell more of their red widgets or whatever they're selling. And I think too, with just the proliferation we have of media, the ability to be praised by other people for what you've done, like, you know 40 years ago, no one would have been filming that
right.
because, like, not
To
everyone had
film
a
it would have been a pain.
not everyone had a camera in their
Wasn't
pocket,
just,
right?
yeah, high definition
Exactly.
video.
Yeah, and then a platform like, YouTube or Instagram or whatever social media of choice to put it on.
Yeah,
So
and
that has a lot to do with it.
it is interesting that you mentioned kind of the cultural element of it where that's concerned, because um well uh and I hate when like I don't know exactly how to say someone's name. You know what I mean? Like it's particularly since it's like somebody we know. It's Bilal uh, from CA before.
Mhm, mhm.
Where you're saying he was, here to say hi to Lauren. So see, you are the
Oh,
popular
hey,
guy.
Bilal. Yeah, I was just chatting him up in DMs the other day.
He's just sliding into his DMs.
He's a nice dude.
And Rodrigo was here too, where he's saying like, and I think he was saying this as a response to what I was talking about. Where we're saying that's a perception that comes from a Jew-Christian morality group surrounded by, even if you don't believe in God. Uh, in that case, I don't disagree that the community can instill these beliefs because, like, even as you said, like there's your faith, but then there's also kind of like all the other things that surround it, right? But in my case, I don't believe that was the case because I was in kindergarten, and I know that you can instill faith and beliefs and stuff like that at a pretty early age, but like I did not have a living environment that shall we say is conducive to a you know healthy, happy kind of situation, you know. But I mean, I guess you could even say that maybe that would be part of the case where, like, it's interesting to me that some of the kindest people, you know, are ones that who grew up in positive circumstances, but also who grew up in very negative circumstances. And it's interesting to me that, like, the intensity of certain situations, and I think you even mentioned it on the previous episode when you were talking about like there were some scenarios where like you were very like stressed out, and then you were very appreciative of some things, and I don't want to butcher the actual example, so I won't, you know, just kind of ad lib it. But I know that for me, like within our community, a lot of people have praised me on like not really letting things get me down for very long. It's not something I feel is very impressive because it's just how I've always been. But like I'm not impressed by a negative thing happening to me because I know that I can handle it. And because I also had previously had like self-worth issues, but also like if something bad happens to somebody else, it's over. Like that's when I get like really upset about something. So like if I held the door open for somebody and they didn't say thank you, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna remember your face, and the next time I'm not gonna hold the door open for you because it's, you know, that's how I look at it. But like if you were being nice to somebody and then somebody was like rude, I don't know how somebody could be rude to you, but I'm sure it does happen. I think I would get much more upset because there's just something to that for me where it's, I guess that the compassion or like the you know, I guess kind of not to assume that it's the same case for both of us, but have you found that in its own form can be the case with you, where like maybe it would upset you more if something bad happens to somebody else compared to yourself? Or
yeah, that's a good question. I think so. I think so that you know, because I know how I deal with stuff and it doesn't bug me. Like I don't really care. If someone's rude to me, it's like whatever. It just doesn't phase me, you know. But I could see that, you know, I've seen other people get offended, and so I would, yeah, definitely be like, hey, that would certainly inspire a little more of that feeling of injustice that we talked about earlier. That's like, hey, that's not right, you know.
I guess in the spirit of that, then, how do you see that? Because you know, you explained that you believe that the reason why is a fundamental link with God and that nature. But then why do you think it would bother you more if it happening to somebody else compared to yourself in that case?
I think because I know how I handle it, and
Okay.
it would not land on me, and it wouldn't phase me. Whereas someone else, it might be destructive. Like my kid, for instance, like my oldest, he's like very, so have you ever heard of the 5 love languages?
Yeah, I
You
think
heard of
my
this?
girlfriend's mentioned it before.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not familiar, super familiar with it.
I'm not a huge believer in all of it, but I think it
Girls
is.
usually are more invested in it than guys are.
Yeah, it's a helpful lens to. I think of it more like a personality test. Like, you know what I mean? So it's kind of a helpful lens to view people through, almost as like a personality test. Well, anyway, there's 5 love languages. There's like gifts, words of affirmation, quality time, physical touch, and then acts of service. And it's interesting to see my kids, like certain of those really impact my wife. And that's, I guess, originally it was the context of a romantic, marriage relationship, but it also can be like your kids. And I've noticed, like, my youngest, who's 8, like, he is driven by quality time. Like, he's constantly, Dad, will you play with me? Dad, will you do this? Dad, will you do this? Quality time is big for him. My middle child just turned 12. Like, physical touch is like a big deal for him. So he always wants to like sit next to you and like kind of just like cuddle up next to you. So, that's really impacts him. My oldest is words of affirmation. And so he's constantly asking for, not explicitly, but the questions that he asks, you can tell he wants affirmation. He'd be like, Dad, did you see me do this? Did you see me do this? What'd you think about this? Anyway, that's a long way of introducing. I know my oldest child is very sensitive to what other people say about him, and he craves people to affirm him verbally. So if someone were to say something non-affirming to me, I'd be like, oh, whatever, I don't care. Like, I am who I am, and I kind of am confident enough in myself. It's like, you're not going to hurt my feelings. But if someone did that to my kid, that could be, that could really stick with him and really, really injure him. So for that reason, like, yeah, I'd be more protective of those who I think would actually have that injury from something.
And I guess that comes back to the notion of, because I think that one thing that I'm thinking of now is, like, when you mentioned what your explanation was for, like, why I would be upset about like the injustices and why I would naturally be kind, something else occurs to me, which I'm not going to say is separate from what you're talking about, since I hadn't established the context, but at least the context is a separate element, where there's also simply the nature of compassion, because there is that notion of this is not right, but then there's also that caring of how it impacts that person. And I think that those, while they may be related or not, it's certainly not the same thing. You know what I mean? And both of them can be encapsulated in what you mentioned. But like, if like it's an interesting balance when it comes to me, because the way I always explain it is, I have a very good heart, but I also have a very small heart. And the way that I explain that is, like, if I don't like you, you can fall off a cliff. I don't care. Like, I'm very, very fundamental in that case. If I had to like sacrifice 50 people, like if I had to press a button and like 50 people just vanish, or like somebody that I care about is, I'm going to smash the 50-person thing as many times as I have to, not because I like wants to, but in this hypothetical situation, because the value of something that is important to me is just infinitely more important to me than the things that are just not a big deal. And so in that sense, like, I've always been really heavily invested in the people that I care about. And then I want to give those I don't know the benefit of the doubt and try to be kind. But then once I feel that I've been wrong in that sense, I'm like, I don't care if they apologize. I don't care if they feel bad even. In fact, if I believe that they would continue doing so. And so, I mean, there's going to be somebody who's going to say, "Oh, that's because you're a Sagittarius or whatever." But you know what I mean? Like, I don't believe in, like, in stuff that's significant. But it's interesting to me in that sense, because there are people who have compassion for everybody in that sense, where even if they've been wronged a number of times, they're still going to kind of have that givingness to them. And then, like, where I come from, it's very much a I don't really know how to describe it, but it's I guess, like, don't punish me for making you an ally or being an ally of you. You know what I mean? So I guess, how do you kind of see that nature, particularly like regarding like your faith? It's funny because I wasn't trying to make the episode fundamentally about that. But since it does inform so much of your character,
Yeah.
I guess it's kind of inevitable. But
So
how do you see that?
how would I be that?
And how do
I
you see it, like in general?
Yeah, I would kind of be one that would be generally compassionate towards all, and would be one that even when wronged multiple times would still pursue what is best for that person.
Mm,
Now that might not mean that I'm, you're still wise,
mm,
right? If someone has, to use an extreme example, if someone is a convicted, child molester, I'm not going to let them around my kid. I'm going to remember what has been done and let that inform how I treat them, so that I am still protecting everything else and being a good steward of everything else, right? But in terms of, like, I would still want to do what was most loving for that person. So that's pretty much how I would be in any situation, is to seek what is in the honest best interest of that person and what's the most loving. Now that may not necessarily be what they want,
right.
and that may not necessarily be what other people might think is the most loving. I mean, to use an extreme example, um, if someone wanted to borrow $20, and I knew for a fact that they would take that $20 and go buy illegal drugs or whatever, it would actually be unloving for me to give them that $20 and to keep them locked in that cycle of addiction. The loving thing would be to not give them that $20. So that's an extreme example, but that would be my goal. Would, yeah, to be loving to every person in every situation.
So I guess in to stay in line with the extreme examples thing, say that somebody had like harmed somebody who was important to you. How would you kind of have that relationship there? Like, well, how would those how would those two elements, I guess, kind of like inform each other and you know,
Yeah. So, okay. So, I mean, first of all, I mean, I think it's important to point out, like, I'm a sinner, right? And we have sin within us. I struggle with that sin nature. So, this would not be like easy. Okay. When you talk about loving people, particularly if it goes against what we sinfully don't want to do, it's not like it would be just effortless for me to love someone the way I should be loved. I would struggle
right,
with the fleshly feelings of, like, all right, you mess with my kid, like, you're dead to me. Like, I'm going to come down on you hard, right? Um, but to answer that, I mean, it's hard to say. You would have to really just kind of look at the individual situation, but
right,
you'd want to be loving and protective of those that you are supposed to love and protect, your family, but yet loving of this other person, and figure out a way that those two could, whatever situation is the wisest to put those two in the best scenario. And that's where it's kind of hard to come up with hypotheticals,
without like exact context. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But I certainly would want to just make the best decision you can, and I do have a special, obviously a special responsibility and stewardship over, my family, being more protective of them. I'm called to be, rather than uh, I would be to just an average person, out there. But yeah, I would certainly want to be loving towards everyone.
hmm.
Yeah.
It is interesting to me in that sense where it's like I wonder because I think in a lot of these cases it fundamentally comes down to like how people see the situation, right? Because like you said, uh, giving the addict $20 would not actually be kind,
Mm,
but somebody else could also see, well, by giving them like the money or whatever, maybe you'd show that you still believe in them or whatever. Like I don't see it that way, but I
mhm,
can there's going to be kind of like those striations of perspectives of
mhm.
what it would mean to be kind in that sense.
Yeah, and sometimes it could be, let's say that there's someone who has just has not been financially responsible. And sometimes repeatedly helping that person actually is harmful,
Mhm.
because you could, you maybe at the beginning you're helping them out, but if they don't turn from their ways and become more financially responsible, they're just going to keep going back to the same problem, and you haven't changed their heart. So
Yeah.
continuing to help them out may actually, in that case, the most loving thing to do might be to withdraw that support and let them feel the pain of their consequences so that they will change. Now, when we
Yeah.
talk about people feeling pain, that would be, I think I've heard it phrased that you would want them to be hurt, but not to be harmed. In other
Hmm.
words, like, they may experience the pain, but you really wouldn't want any like serious, permanent consequences from that, right? But
Right.
so that there would be some wise way for you to handle that. But that just goes to show you that what someone might say, what someone might think is, their gut reaction, the most loving thing to do, might not actually be the most loving. It does take sometimes some wisdom in choosing the most loving course of action.
Right. At what point or what amount of fish that you're giving someone are you essentially harming them and discouraging them from learning how to fish themselves?
Mm-hmm.
Like, to use the example of, give someone a fish, you feed them for a day, teach them to fish and, feed them for a lifetime or whatever it is. Um, and I guess it's interesting to me, even just like the perspective of it, because like to me, uh, when it comes to, I mean, this is very philosophical, but I guess it does still kind of tie back to the nature of kindness. If someone is going to be harmful of others, particularly those that I care about, I don't like, for me, I lose the reason to want to be supportive of them because I see them as simply destructive in
Mm.
that sense. Because I think I mentioned it before, where like if somebody does something that really screws me or somebody I care about over, I don't really care how they feel about it afterwards. I don't care if they regret it because the consequences not changed.
Mm.
Road to hell pay with best intention and all that. Like, okay, you feel bad about it, but like, what are you going to do to change it? And so for
Mm.
me, that's at the same time, if I see that somebody has actually changed, that is,
Mhm.
I am generally willing to give them that second chance because now I do see them as a different person,
Yeah.
right? So it's just interesting to me how we come at that similarly, but it's like you're coming at it like horizontally, I'm coming at it vertically or something, because I'm like, I will give someone infinite chances if I see them growing each time.
Mm.
If I see that they're not the same person making the same mistake.
Mhm.
But if I do see that they're the same person making the same mistake, I pretty much lose all of my compassion right there,
Mm.
because now I'm thinking, it's like, okay, kind of an extension of what you were talking about. By supporting this person or allowing them to do this or whatever, by permitting this, I see it as endorsing, allowing them to continue doing this thing that is hurting other people, which oftentimes, whether you see it as being weak, evil, having sin or so, they generally take advantage of kind people who may not have as much wisdom as
Mm.
some other ones. And so for me, I see the act of supporting them being able to continue functioning, I guess, is tantamount to supporting those negative things as I see it they've done to others.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah, no.
interesting.
Yeah, no, to be clear, like I mean, that's a good point. If someone is like actively destructive, right? Like if someone is seeking the harm of others, then that's, yeah, then that's different. Then that's where um maybe the most loving thing for them to do is not to support them in that, but to point to them the error of their ways and try to turn them from that,
Mm,
and not seek to support them in their evil doing, right? And the most loving thing to do toward their victims would be to not support them, but to try to, seek justice. So yeah, absolutely. It really, I think, is imperative that we just define, you get clear on what's loving, right?
mm,
It may not look the way people would, the gut kind of knee jerk reaction that people might have of, oh, loving is just being nice to the person, or, this superficial, what someone would perceive as niceness. It may be the most loving thing to do can sometimes, let people fall on their face. The most loving thing to do is turn people over to the law. The most loving thing to do is to, oppose someone for their own good. Sometimes love, the actual true love, is different from how some people superficially might think it might look.
Yeah, kindness and niceness don't, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they're definitely not mutually inclusive either. And I guess that kind of brings me around to, I know that fundamentally the reason you would probably say why people would be unkind would be because of elements of sin. But I guess on the level, and if it's impossible to answer without going to that, I understand. But if not going to that depth, why do you think that people will be like, will lack empathy, or they will discriminate against others? Like, to use an example of, for example, think of the people who profess to be Christian, but they're incredibly nasty. Like, that's, the gay hating people and so on. Why do you think that somebody would end up being like that when they believe that they have the best of intentions?
That's a good question. I think there's multiple reasons, right? Some people would just be selfish. I mean, you are right, it's sin, right? And that's kind of the foundation of it all. But I think say someone who's just more selfish. Well, that might be that maybe they've never thought of their intentions as the most loving. They would not tell you that they have the most loving intentions toward the other people. They would just say that they don't see the need to be like that. They're just looking out for number one, or however they want to phrase it. It would just be that selfishness. I think that could be one branch of it. And then other people are, they may be misguided about they may not see love as the most important. There are multiple explanations. Maybe they're misguided in the best way to love someone, or maybe they are standing for what they perceive as justice and truth at the expense of love, and they end up doing that in a way that some don't appreciate. And I think that is often tricky in our culture, because our culture, the Bible is always opposed to culture, right? No culture is going to gel perfectly with the Bible. If you were to look at any culture in history, they would look at some aspects of the Bible and be like, oh, cool, I got that. I love that. But this part over here, we're not so sure about that. Take ours, like our culture, right? Like this idea of like love, like our culture is all about love. Our culture is like, yeah, like love your neighbor, like cool, totally dig that, right? But our culture would be like, well, wait, the Bible says this about homosexuality. We disagree with that. The Bible, says this about life, or says this about justice, or says, our culture might butt up, against that, right? Other cultures, they're fine with that, but they might be like, if you were to go to many Mideastern cultures, I'm not an expert, but I've heard this, right? That if you go to many Mideastern cultures, the idea of turning the other cheek is insanity to them. It's like, why would you do that? You would just get walked all over, and they just can't process that. So it's a long way of saying that there would be it would be sin. Maybe some people that would be perceived as gay hating, maybe they just they have that message of biblical truth that they're not communicating in love. It could be other people are loving at the expense of truth, and they would look at something that is sin and say it's not sin, and that's not loving, right? But they may think they're loving, but they're loving at the expense of truth, which is not really love. So all of that's to, to say it does go back, it does go back to sin, as you said earlier. And it is, I don't say it's complicated, but human behavior, there's so many variety of motivations, there's so many things going on within the human heart, that sin would be an accurate word to describe it all. But breaking it down more specifically, it would, there might be a lot of different instances where each would be a different sin. Here it's the sin of selfishness. Here it's this sin. Here it's that sin. Here it's this sin. That kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it, again, like I never want to like put you in a situation where I'm saying it's like, oh, well, how do you see this? But minus like one of the most fundamental elements of like what you believe in, you know what I mean? But it's like,
yeah, no, I could talk about it all day. No worries.
So I guess from that perspective, since we've been using a number of extreme examples, and then we can kind of, start wrapping it up, because I do want to be respectful of your time. But one of people's most favorite examples of, the definition of evil and all this other stuff, Hitler,
mm-hmm.
believed, as far as anything that I've read, that he was acting from integrity, from whatever, that he was doing the right thing. There's nothing as far as that I've consumed or observed that showed that he was basically just playing it up,
Mm-hmm.
because he was telling people what they thought or what they wanted to hear. So from that perspective, you have someone who, had the impact that everybody has some idea of in the modern day, which is to say negative impact, predominantly negative impact. How would you kind of look at, I mean him, but like, that kind of situation where you have someone who, like Germany had been wronged after World War I and such, and there was a lot of pain that was going on, and he did feel for what he perceived as his German brethren. But yeah, like obviously there's also everything else that was tied into that. So just to kind of, I guess throw like a curveball at you, just to, to see how you see it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not an expert on Hitler. I mean, I know a little bit about him, obviously, just having been educated, but, I mean, clearly, like you mentioned earlier, that would be sin, and Hitler was just misguided. I guess that's probably actually way too gentle a way of putting it, but the idea is that, he was wrong, and he had his beliefs. He perceived others as the enemy, and I think that's one thing that's important. As Christians, we don't struggle against other people. We struggle against sin, and we struggle against sinful thought patterns. So a Christian battle, whatever, I wouldn't necessarily use that term, right? But advancing Christian causes doesn't come in the sense of persecuting, people. Doesn't come in the sense of trying to harm people, but in the sense of trying to free people from sinful thought patterns and sinful beliefs. That is for their good, right? That's the loving thing to do. So, Hitler was just wrong, and thought that, yeah. So there might have been a political climate for that in Germany, but he blamed it on, the Jews. He saw them as the problem, and he unlovingly, targeted other people, and then used the power of rhetoric and that political firestorm to get people behind his cause, which was sin clearly. So it just shows that hatred of people, right? Racism, sexism, however it manifests itself, it's not the Christian ethic to hate people, even those who are sinners, right? Even those in the depths of what would be perceived as sin. I mean, someone on death row for being a serial killer, clearly you could look and say nothing less than that sinful. No one would argue with that. but we still love that person and we don't hate that person. We would seek what's best, for them, which may be to just repent and then live out the rest of their life on death row, or be, at the hands of the state, brought to justice with death, or however that works. But that is, yeah, hopefully that's helpful, that as Christians, we war against thought patterns, against the powers of evil out there, not against other people.
It is interesting to me, because I feel like I've, so far, like talking about things, I've been able to appreciate elements of where you're coming from. But there are definitely cases where I didn't necessarily understand it in the sense where I could that I could feel it close enough, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Like I could understand the rationale of it, but to me, I can see how it's a lot easier to, or not to say easier, but more aligned to be compassionate when you don't see something as being a flaw of that person. It's like more like seeing it as like, I don't know, having like a sliver in them or something that just kind of infects them. Like it's like something else that is
Yeah.
external of that person that is kind of, incorporated into them, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting way of characterizing. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a sliver.
Yeah, it's just like, the metaphor that occurred to me.
Yeah. No, I mean, and the reality is that we're all sinners, right? I mean, we're all sinners. We all were created in the image of God, and we all turned our back on him and hated him and did what was wrong. And we all lived in sin, and we were all horrible sinners and, destined for hell. And apart from the activity of God in my life, I mean, I would have been the worst sinner, as would anyone else apart from the activity of God in their life. So when you have that realization of who you are, and then so it's only through Christ's activity in your life that brings you out of that, then and restrains you from that, you have compassion on people in that situation because you don't feel better than them. You have compassion that we all have a common disease, and some people may have a higher manifestation of this disease. And that's something that, and they're complicit in that, right? They're, I don't want to say that Hitler was a victim. That's not the point. But the idea is that we all have sin. And you could look at a serial killer on death row, to use that example, and say that, hey, you have sin, I have sin. It's not that it's a sliver within you. It's who you are. Like, it is your nature, but there's a sliver in there of someone who is made in the image of God. That's also part of your nature. And then when the Holy Spirit works in that person and that person comes to faith, they become a new creation. They have a new nature, where all of a sudden there are those two competing natures within them, of the nature of righteousness and the nature of sin, that are doing battle for the rest of their life. You still have that indwelling sin. I still have indwelling sin within me, as my sinful nature, competes against that Holy Spirit, that Christ nature within you, that new creation nature that you have. And that one day when I die, that battle will be over. But until then, everyone has those, every believer has those two natures, and every unbeliever just has that one nature. So hopefully maybe that kind of clarifies some things.
Yeah, and it's interesting for me even to, because I mean, obviously, when you have people whose fundamental truths they see as being very different, it's interesting to me to see kind of like, I forget if it's what the Venn diagram, whatever it is, like the two circles that overlap.
The
There's like
Venn diagram, yeah.
Venn diagram. Okay, I got two of the
close
letters
enough.
right. But for me, like, I see it as like, even though it may not be what the actual belief is, it essentially allows you to, while you do see that sin is an inherent part of the person, you're also kind of like externalizing it in the sense of like, because it is not that person that originated this thing, the concept of like the original sin and everything. it becomes, I think, easier to be compassionate in that sense because, again, it's not an individualized flaw in that sense. It's seen as something that everybody shares
Mm.
to whatever extent, and it's almost like you have to, because it's so fundamental as part of your belief, you would essentially have to be a hypocrite to be able to judge it, because you would essentially be judging yourself in that sense, which I imagine is kind of where the, like, the, well, not the expression, but the the thing of, don't point to the what is it, the splinter in your brother's eye when you can't see
Yeah.
the beam in your own. And I went to Catholic school a few years. I know some of the
Yeah.
some
And
of
you
the
can
examples.
judge it, right? You can judge it in the sense of ascertaining right and wrong, right? Like
Right,
you
condemn it, I guess, is like where I'm kind of coming from, and like the,
yeah. I think that that belongs to God, right? We can just point to the truth and we can say, um, this is what, this is what the Bible says. And in some cases of people who are overt sinners, and I mean, there's, the most loving thing to do is to point out their sin and to just be like, this is the truth, that like this is wrong, to call wrong wrong, right?
mm,
Like the case of Hitler or something, like the best thing to do in that case would be like, this is wrong, to call wrong wrong, to judge that as when we compare what's happening to the truth of what should be, like the truth is like, this is wrong, like I'm judging that as wrong. But then you leave the eternal condemnation, you leave that in Christ's hands, and what you still seek is that is for things to be restored,
mm.
right? What we seek is not necessarily you're wrong, so it's over for you. What the ideal of what we seek is, you're wrong, so turn from your ways and then stop doing what's wrong, you know?
And I think something that's interesting there, though, is that, like, for example, uh, a big part of what made, Hitler the Hitler that we know was outside circumstances as well, because of like his experiences in the war. And I know you said you're not like an expert on it. I'm not going to say that I'm an expert on Hitler,
Mm.
but I've read a number of things into him and like watched documentaries and stuff because war does fascinate me. But like one element of it where it's that Germany was legitimately just screwed over after World War One, as I already said. And so you have a situation where, you know, that doesn't mean that he never would have been, never would have discriminated against, an arbitrary characteristic is how I see it. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, it was Jews, but like it could have been, clowns as far as I'm concerned. Like it's like it doesn't matter in the sense of like it was equally baseless regardless of that,
Mm.
as I see it. But at the same time, what he became was also indirectly, well, no, not indirectly, also directly impacted by the imperfections or whatever, the wrongful acts, to put it shortly, of others.
Mm.
Because if Germany hadn't been in that spot, first of all, it wouldn't have been desperate enough that he would have had the chance to get where he ended up. But also a lot of these other things, he probably wouldn't have felt as extreme as he did. And I mean, I don't know that that's the case, but I do know that that was an incredibly difficult time to live in.
Mm.
And it's interesting to me to think of, we're all responsible, as I see it at least, we're all responsible for how we act, for the decisions we make. At the same time, there's also that intrinsic nature of kind of the yin and yang of it, but we're also necessarily impacted by the things around us as well. And so, like you said, like if you try your best to be compassionate towards others, even if they're not acting righteously, is what I'll say, but correctly, whatever. But it's also going to vary depending on the situation, because like somebody who your wife told you cut her off is not the same as somebody who like literally attacked your family, right?
Mm.
Uh, so from that same uh, perspective, kind of zooming it out to be a much more significant element of it, it's like, yes, there's still the intrinsic element of how Hitler was, but then there's also that larger element, that context as well, of what informed the person that he became in that sense. And so he may be responsible in his own right, but then there's also those other things that impacted it. And I guess it's just interesting to me to think of that kind of balance in terms of like how wrong was this person if part of it was being impacted by something else in that sense as well,
Yeah, I mean, the world is complicated and there are
Yeah.
multiple influences on people. My personal opinion is, I mean, I don't think that blame needs to be like a zero-sum game.
Right. Can be
So,
mutually
like,
exclusive
or everyone
or
could,
include whatever.
yeah, it doesn't even need to be partial blame. Like in that case, you could say like, all right, all these people who did wrong, like
Did wrong.
you did wrong, and look at the consequences of your wrong. Was it eventually led to like Hitler? So like what you did was wrong. What Hitler did was wrong. I don't think that Hitler bears 85% blame or 73% blame. I don't think that he bears 100%. What he did was wrong, right?
Of what he did, yeah.
And
Gotcha.
and then the people who voted or participated in furthering whatever his aims were, they're 100% wrong for what they did. I think that it is a little too simplistic to say that there were no causes or no factors that weighed into that, as you pointed out. But still, I don't think blame is parsed up like it's 12% here, 36% here, etc.
Right. There's the different percentages of what ultimately caused something, but each individual is 100% responsible for the individual contribution rather than partial responsibility for the larger contribution or the larger issue. Yeah, it's complicated, like you said.
Yeah, but I mean, it is. But in another point, like it's really simple in that you just don't sin. Like that's the goal. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
I feel like that should be a meme. Like, just don't sin, bro.
well, that's obviously a drastic oversimplification, right?
Well, I
But
know. What's a meme? Like, of course it is.
But we have a book that tells us how to live, and you just like follow that, and then like we don't have to worry about retroactively looking back and splitting things up and 73% blame here. What about this? What about this? It's like at the end of the day, like really as humans, rather than looking back and trying to understand the minutia about right and wrong, like we know what right is, we know what wrong is. We were told, just like learn that truth and then live out that truth. And I'm not saying that's easy. I'm not saying it's completely simple. Sometimes there can be situations where wisdom and discernment is needed, lots. But for the most part, I mean, God is not silent on, God is not silent about that. And apart from the situations where, wisdom is really needed, it's not even really hard a lot of times to know. We know, like the Holy Spirit will kind of tell you, testify that like, hey, remember this, like you shouldn't do that. So it's just kind of, you do what's right and you don't do what's wrong.
And it is interesting to me to think of kind of to bring it back home where it's like what we were saying, where like for you, that goodness is intrinsically like linked with Jesus. But even for me, there's still the goodness element of like of wanting to be kind, and why why we do it. Ultimately, it comes back to goodness. Whatever name you have for it, whatever source there is for it, whatever belief system or faith specifics are involved with it, there is always going to be that element of goodness. And for people who are kind, there's also that I'll say ritual just for the sake of simplicity, but of gratitude, like practicing the ritual of gratitude, of choosing to be grateful for whatever it is. Like for you, it's Jesus' love. For me, it could simply be like having kind, wonderful people who could be out making money or spending time with their family, but they're here talking to me on my podcast, and so it's interesting to me that no matter what system of belief somebody has, no matter where their faith lies, there are still those things that connect us through, you know, an infinite divide that also makes it a, you know, not so, you know, divided elements to begin with, because regardless of where that love or kindness comes from, the goodness that unites us regardless. And I think that is part of why people who can, you know, fundamentally, like the specifics, they can believe something very different, can still be so unified at the same time. You know what I mean? So like I know that to see it that way would like probably be like fundamentally different, you know, from how where your beliefs come from in the sense, but it's like that's just kind of how I see it, where it's I like that element that even when people don't see things, you know, as being fundamentally from the same source, there's still those, you know, those Venn diagram moments that connects it.
That's a deep parting thought, man. Thanks for letting me be on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for coming on and, you know, talking about it at length with me for so long. I know that I just kind of, you know, catapult things out there sometimes.
It's fun. Fun as always.
Cool. Well, that'll be the end of this episode. And yes, for more wonderful conversations, continue checking out other episodes. And
why do you get the British voice or whatever accent this is?
I don't know why I do it's the transatlantic accent.
Okay.
For your information. I just started doing it like a long time ago. And for whatever reason, I just ended up doing impersonations. So
do it then. I liked it.
Yes. Well, that's also where the old sports thing comes from. You know, you see. Yes. It's fun fact, it was actually manufactured, like the transatlantic thing was literally made in America for like the gilded screen and for like radios. That's why because the audio quality was really crappy back then. And everything was very like rounded. I mean, you're an audiophile, you understand, you know, like the element of it. And so you had lots of clipped T's so that when they talked, you would always hear it, even when things were kind of like blurred out like that. So it's kind of interesting, again, like how different things inform each other.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
So that's your bit of trivia for the day, everyone.
Yeah, I did contribute something after all.
No, it was a great podcast.